Imagine a rapper, a Harlem legend, a man who once wore pink fur coats to Knicks games just because he could, walks onto national television, looks dead into the camera, and says three words that shook the entire city of New York. Finish the job. That's it. That's all it took. 3 words. And the whole city felt it in their chest. Because this wasn't just some celebrity hopping on a bandwagon. This was Cameron, Killer Cam, the Dipset general, the man who grew up in Harlem when the streets were rough and the Knicks were the only religion people trusted. This was a man who had been waiting his whole life for this moment. A man whose passion for the blue and orange wasn't about clout or cameras. It was blood. It was identity. It was survival. And those 3 words, they became the battle cry of a city that hadn't tasted a championship in over half a century. But to understand why those words hit so differently, you have to go back. Way back. Back to the streets of Harlem. Back to the gardens, not just Madison Square Garden, but the actual concrete playgrounds where basketball and hip-hop were born from the same heartbeat. Back to when the Knicks were the kings of the NBA, when Willis Reed limped out of that tunnel, when Clyde Frazier was gliding across the hardwood in his silk suits and wide-brimmed hats, when New York wasn't just a city, it was the center of the universe. You have to understand the love before you can understand the pain. And you have to understand the pain before you can understand what it meant when Cameron stood up and said enough is enough. This is that story. Let's set the scene. It's 1973. New York City. The streets are electric. The Knicks are the most dominant team in basketball. Willis Reed, Walt Frazier, Dave DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, Earl Monroe. These weren't just players. They were the soul of an entire city dressed in basketball shoes. And on May 10, 1973, they did it. The New York Knicks won the NBA championship. The streets of New York erupted. People poured out of apartments, out of bodegas, out of barbershops. There were tears. There was dancing. There was this feeling, this incredible, indescribable feeling, that anything was possible. That New York City was untouchable. And then, the wait began. What nobody knew that night, what nobody could have predicted, was that it would be over 50 years before that feeling came back. Over half a century. A drought so long, so brutal, so absolutely painful, that it became a running joke. The Knicks became a punchline. The Knicks became what you said when you wanted to describe heartbreak in basketball form. Think about that for a second. Kids were born. They grew up. They had kids of their own. Those kids grew up and had kids. And none of them, not one generation, got to see the New York Knicks lift a trophy. That's not a losing streak. That's a generational curse. Now, while all of this was happening, while the Knicks were breaking hearts year after year, the streets of Harlem were producing something else. Something that would eventually become just as important to the city as basketball itself. Hip-hop. And right in the middle of that cultural explosion, a kid named Cameron Giles was growing up in East Harlem, on 138th Street. He wasn't just any kid. He was that kid, the one who could ball and rap, the one who walked with a certain kind of swagger that only comes from surviving New York City streets. He loved 2 things more than almost anything in this world: his city and the Knicks. This kid would go on to become Cameron. Killer Cam. One of the most original, most creative, most uniquely New York rappers to ever pick up a microphone. The leader of Dipset, the Diplomats, a crew that took over hip-hop in the early 2000s with a sound and a style that was unmistakably, unapologetically New York. And through all of it, through the platinum albums, through the movies, through the fashion, through everything, Cameron never stopped being a Knicks fan. Never. Not when they were losing. Not when they were embarrassing. Not even when the whole league was laughing at them. Because that's what it means to be from New York. You don't leave when things get hard. You stay. You fight. You believe. Now, the 2000s were a rough time for Knicks fans. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine watching your team, the team you grew up with, the team that's supposed to represent everything about the greatest city in the world, making bad trade after bad trade. Overpaying players who didn't deliver. Cycling through coaches like they were changing socks. The Garden, once the loudest arena in the NBA, started feeling like a funeral. The lows were genuinely low. Historically low. Embarrassingly low. But here's the thing about New York, and about Knicks fans specifically, they never stopped showing up. They booed, sure. They complained, absolutely. But they came back every single time. Because real love isn't about the good times. Real love is about what you do when things fall apart. And Cameron, he was right there with them. Every step of the way. Through the bad contracts. Through the coaching disasters. Through the drafts that didn't go right. He stayed. He wore the colors. He repped the city. That's how deep the connection runs. Then something started to shift. It was quiet at first. Almost invisible. In 2021, a man named Leon Rose took over as the Knicks general manager. Now, Leon Rose wasn't a typical basketball executive. He was an agent. A negotiator. A man who had represented some of the biggest names in the game, LeBron James, Allen Iverson, and he brought a completely different mindset to building a team. He didn't just look at stats. He looked at character. He looked at culture. He wanted to build something that felt like family, not just a roster of talented individuals. And slowly, piece by piece, he started building something in New York. The first big piece was Jalen Brunson. Now, when the Knicks signed Jalen Brunson in 2022, people weren't exactly doing backflips. He was a solid player coming from Dallas, but he wasn't a household name. He was 6'2" in a league full of giants. Critics said he was too small to be a franchise cornerstone. They said he was a nice player, but not the guy who could carry a team to a championship. Those critics were wrong. Spectacularly wrong. Because Jalen Brunson didn't just come to New York to play basketball. He came to New York to become something bigger than himself. And from the moment he stepped into Madison Square Garden, something clicked. The city felt it. The fans felt it. Even through the TV screen, you could see that this man was different. He played with a calm that was almost supernatural. When the game was on the line, when the pressure was at its absolute highest, Jalen Brunson looked like he was playing in his backyard. Ice water in his veins. Heart of a lion. The kind of player that coaches dream about and cities fall in love with. Then came more pieces. Josh Hart. OG Anunoby. Mikal Bridges. Each one arrived with their own story, their own sacrifice. When the Knicks traded 5 first-round picks to get Mikal Bridges from Brooklyn, people thought they were crazy. 5 picks. That's an enormous price. That's betting your future on the present. But Leon Rose didn't blink. He knew what he was building. And then, in the summer of 2024, he made his boldest move. He traded for Karl-Anthony Towns. Karl-Anthony Towns. One of the most gifted big men in the history of the game. A 7-footer who could shoot threes like a guard, pass like a point guard, and dominate the paint like a true center. But KAT, that's what people called him, carried his own weight. His own story. His own pain. His mother, Jackie Towns, had passed away from complications with COVID-19 in 2020. It was a wound that never fully healed. And Karl-Anthony carried her with him everywhere he went. In his heart, in his game, in the way he embraced every moment like it might be his last. When he came to New York, he didn't just join a team. He joined a family. And the city embraced him right back. Now let's talk about the 2025-26 season, because this is where the story really starts to take flight. Coming in, the Knicks had something they hadn't had in decades: genuine belief. Not hope. Not wishful thinking. Actual, real, grounded belief that this team could win a championship. But the season started with bumps. In January, they hit a rough patch, a 2-9 stretch that had people questioning everything. Was this team really for real? Were they just another Knicks team that looked good on paper but fell apart when it mattered? Then owner James Dolan did something that surprised everyone. He went on the radio and said something bold. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the Knicks needed to get to the finals. And not just get there. Win it. He said this team should win the NBA championship. Around the league, people laughed. They called it delusional. They said Dolan didn't know what he was talking about. But sometimes, the craziest thing you can do is believe out loud. The regular season settled down. Jalen Brunson found his rhythm. Towns found his footing. The defense, built around OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges, 2 of the best wing defenders in the league, tightened up. Josh Hart, the heart and hustle of the whole operation, dove on floors and charged into crowds and fought for every single loose ball like each one was his last. The Knicks won the NBA Cup in December, their first piece of hardware in forever. Brunson took home the Cup MVP. It was a statement, a flex, a message to the rest of the league that said, "We are here, and we are serious." Then came the playoffs. First round. The Atlanta Hawks. Now, the Hawks were dangerous. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. They had added Jonathan Kuminga and C.J. McCollum at the trade deadline, and they came into this series with something to prove. They were the hunters. The Knicks were the hunted. At Madison Square Garden. The atmosphere was electric from the opening tip. The fans at the Garden were loud, louder than they'd been in years. You could feel the energy vibrating through the concrete. Jalen Brunson dropped 28 points and 7 assists. Karl-Anthony Towns added 25 points and 8 rebounds. The Knicks won 113-102 and took an early lead in the series. But then the Hawks pushed back. Same building. The Knicks were cruising, up 12 points in the fourth quarter. And then C.J. McCollum, a veteran, a guy who's been in big games before, took over. The Hawks went on a run. They clawed back. They tied it. And in the final moments, they stole the game. 107-106. The Garden went silent. Just like that, the series was tied. And for a brief, terrifying moment, the ghost of last year, the ghost of every Knicks collapse in recent memory, started to creep in. The Hawks were fired up on their home court. Kuminga and McCollum combined to pour it on. The Knicks lost. They were down in the series. Their backs were against the wall. This is where great teams show who they really are. The Knicks needed this one desperately. And they answered. Josh Hart talked about it afterward. He said they put themselves in that position, but they were ready to answer. And answer they did. The Knicks held the Hawks to 44 points at halftime. 41% shooting from the field. 24% from three. The defense was suffocating. The offense was efficient. New York won 114-98 and tied the series. Jalen Brunson was something from another world. He scored 39 points. The Knicks won by 29, led by 32 at one point. It wasn't a basketball game. It was a statement. Then came the exclamation point. Game 6 in Atlanta. The Knicks came in and put on a show for the ages. A first half so dominant, so breathtaking, that it set a record, a 47-point halftime margin. The Knicks were in another stratosphere. Series over. Knicks move on. And that's when the camera found Cameron. He was on ESPN's First Take, sitting next to Stephen A. Smith, and he was absolutely buzzing. You could see it in his eyes. The kid from 138th Street. The Harlem legend. The man who had been a Knicks fan through the darkest days of that 53-year drought, through every bad trade, every coaching carousel, every early exit. He was sitting there in 2026, watching his team roll through the playoffs, and he could barely contain himself. He said. He didn't say it quietly. He said it the way only Cameron can say something, with his whole chest, with his whole heart, with the weight of every Knicks loss he'd ever suffered sitting right behind those 3 words. Finish the job. And the internet lost its mind. The clip went everywhere. Every Knicks fan who saw it felt something in their soul wake up. Because Cameron wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every person in New York who had been waiting. Every kid who grew up without a championship. Every adult who remembered 1973 only from old grainy footage. Every grandmother who told her grandkids stories about Willis Reed limping onto the court and the whole city holding its breath. Cameron was the voice of 53 years of patience finally reaching its breaking point. The Philadelphia 76ers. Now, normally a Knicks-Sixers series would be a whole drama in and of itself. There's history there. There's rivalry. There's bad blood. But this Sixers team was in the middle of its own rebuilding chapter, and the Knicks, riding the momentum from that Hawks series, were locked in. The Knicks swept through the conference semifinals in 5 games. Brunson was exceptional. Towns was dominant. The defense never relented. Anunoby and Bridges, those 2 wings, those 2 defensive masterpieces, made life miserable for every shooter the Sixers had. By the time the series ended, it felt less like a battle and more like an inevitability. The Knicks were going to the Eastern Conference Finals. For the second straight year. Eastern Conference Finals. The Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cavaliers were a good team. A really good team. They had Donovan Mitchell, one of the best scorers in the league, and Evan Mobley, a young big man who could do it on both ends of the floor. They had beaten the Toronto Raptors in the second round and came in with confidence. But this Knicks team was different from last year's team that lost to the Pacers. This team had been through the fire. This team had been down in a series and fought back. This team had developed a toughness that no opponent could rattle. The series was competitive. It stretched to multiple games. But every time the Cavaliers made a run, every time they looked like they were about to take control, the Knicks had an answer. Answer after answer after answer. A shift happened, something that effectively decided the whole series. The Knicks proved their stamina, their will, their ability to outlast the Cavaliers when it counted most. And from that point, Cleveland had no answer. The Knicks advanced to the NBA Finals. For the first time since 1999. Over a quarter century. The Garden exploded. The streets of New York exploded. From Harlem to the Bronx to Brooklyn to Queens to Staten Island, the whole city was alive in a way it hadn't been in a very, very long time. And somewhere in all of that noise, Cameron was somewhere in Harlem, hollering at the top of his lungs. The 2026 NBA Finals. New York Knicks versus San Antonio Spurs. Now, the Spurs were a great story in their own right. Victor Wembanyama, the 7'3" French phenom, the most unique player on planet Earth, had carried San Antonio through the Western Conference and arrived at the finals like a force of nature. He was 22 years old, impossibly long, impossibly gifted. People were calling him the future of basketball. But standing between Wembanyama and a championship was Karl-Anthony Towns. And KAT was not moving. From the very first tip-off of Game 1, the battle between these two was something to behold. Two elite big men, on the biggest stage in the sport. Wembanyama brought his supernatural length and shot blocking. Towns brought his shooting, his rebounding, his passing, and something extra. Something that came from deep inside, from carrying the memory of his mother, from years of being told he couldn't win when it mattered. Through 2 games, the Knicks took a 2-0 lead, and Towns was the reason. He was stuffing the stat sheet, nearly 20 points, 12 rebounds, for assists per game. He was shooting 56% from the field and 43% from 3. He was holding Wembanyama in check on the defensive end. The whole country was watching. Towns kept Wembanyama's brilliance from becoming the series story. He became the series story himself. He's been phenomenal on both sides of the ball, Brunson said about Towns. And that said everything. The Spurs, to their credit, fought back. They weren't going to go quietly. The finals stretched, went to 5 games, and each one was a battle. The kind of basketball that reminds you why you fell in love with the sport in the first place. June 13, 2026. San Antonio, Texas. Frost Bank Center. The Knicks had a chance to close it out. To end the drought. To give New York City the thing it had been waiting 53 years for. The game was intense. Back and forth. The Spurs crowd was electric, trying to will their team to force a game. Wembanyama was a problem, brilliant and relentless. But for every answer Wembanyama had, Brunson had a counterpunch. Jalen Brunson was everywhere. Driving. Finishing through contact. Hitting pull-up jumpers over taller defenders. Making plays when the game was on the line. He finished that series averaging 32.6 points, 4.2 rebounds, and 4.6 assists per game. He was the finals MVP. But more than the numbers, he was the heart and soul of everything the Knicks had built. When the final buzzer sounded and the Knicks won Game 5, Brunson immediately put a towel over his head. He said afterward he knew the face he was going to make would look crazy on TV. He wanted that moment to be just his. He cried. Of course he cried. The whole city cried with him. Karl-Anthony Towns looked for his father and for his fiancée, Jordan Woods, who had become a lucky charm for this team, undefeated in every playoff game she attended, wearing the same bag, the same outfit, showing up and showing out for KAT. That bag, Towns said with a huge smile afterward, is undoubtedly, probably one of the greatest articles of clothing that New York has ever seen. New York has a lot to thank her for. But in a more quiet moment, Towns thought about his mother. Jackie Towns. The woman who raised him. The woman who passed away during COVID in 2020. The woman he dedicated every single game to during this entire playoff run. To be raised by a strong woman is such an honor, he said. And you could see it in his eyes. This championship wasn't just his. It was hers too. OG Anunoby, quiet as always, all action and almost no words, said simply, "This is our dream. This is our goal. And we did it." Mike Brown, the coach who had taken over after Tom Thibodeau was let go the year before, who had himself been fired from other coaching jobs 4 times before landing in New York, this man who understood what it felt like to be counted out, sat in the locker room after the game and said, "It's surreal. I still can't believe it happened." And Brunson, wiping tears from his eyes, pulling himself together enough to address everyone, "It's everything we dreamed of. This is why I came to New York." Then the trophy went up. The Larry O'Brien Trophy. In New York Knicks' hands. For the first time since 1973. Let me put that in perspective one more time, because it deserves to sit there for a moment. The last time the Knicks won a championship, Richard Nixon was the President of the United States. The World Trade Center was still being built. Muhammad Ali was in his prime. There was no internet. There were no cell phones. Hip-hop wasn't even a word yet. Half a century of waiting. And on June 13, 2026, at the Frost Bank Center in San Antonio, Texas, it all ended. The drought was over. Back in New York, the celebration started before the final buzzer even echoed out of the arena. People flooded the streets around Madison Square Garden. In Harlem, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, in Queens, in every borough, in every neighborhood, in every building, people were screaming, hugging strangers, crying into each other's shoulders, calling family members they hadn't spoken to in years just to share the moment. Because this wasn't just a sports championship. This was a release. A release of 53 years of pain and patience and belief in something that kept breaking your heart but never quite let you go. Celebrities were everywhere. Ben Stiller, who had become one of the most visible Knicks superfans through this entire run, literally ran onto the court to record the moment on his phone. Timothée Chalamet, who had been courtside for game after game, was grinning from ear to ear. Cardi B, the Bronx Queen, couldn't hide her joy. Jay-Z, Nas, A$AP Rocky, DJ Khaled, all of them celebrated like the championship was theirs too. Because, in a way, it was. When New York wins, everybody who ever loved New York wins. And the rappers, the hip-hop community that had always been intertwined with the Knicks, they were louder than anyone. Wu-Tang Clan celebrated. Fat Joe, who had been to more games than almost any celebrity during this run, was overcome with emotion. Jadakiss, Remy Ma, French Montana, all of them felt it. The intersection of hip-hop and basketball had always been central to New York's identity. And on this night, those two worlds came together in the most beautiful way possible. A few days later, the championship parade rolled through Manhattan. The streets were packed. Millions of people, millions, lined the route to catch a glimpse of their champions. Jalen Brunson stood on a float and looked out at the crowd. The kid from Metuchen, New Jersey. The man they said was too small. The Finals MVP. He was a man of the people, and this moment proved it beyond any doubt. When he finally got to speak, he was simple and direct, just like he always is on the court. No speeches about himself. No long monologues about what he'd been through. Just gratitude. Just New York. Just love. James Dolan, the owner who had been so vilified by the fanbase for so many years, whose tenure had been marked by so many bad decisions, stood up at City Hall and thanked the fans. And for one moment, even he was forgiven. Because nobody holds grudges on a parade day in New York City. Not when the trophy is right there in your hands. But here's the thing about all of this. Here's the part that ties it all together, the thread that runs from 138th Street to Madison Square Garden to the Frost Bank Center in San Antonio. It was Cameron who said it first. Or said it best. Or said it the way that cut right through all the noise and got straight to the heart of what the city was feeling. 3 words. Spoken by a Harlem rapper with a pink fur coat and a lifetime of love for the blue and orange. A man who had been in the trenches as a Knicks fan for his entire life. A man who had watched the highs and the lows and never wavered, never switched up, never stopped believing. Because that's the thing about Cameron, about his whole persona, his whole brand, everything he represents. He is New York in its purest, most unfiltered form. He's the city without the filter. The city without the apology. The city that wears its heart on its sleeve and dares you to say something about it. When Cameron said finish the job, he wasn't just hyping up a sports team. He was speaking for every kid in Harlem who grew up watching the Knicks on a small TV. Every grandmother who remembered the Willis Reed game. Every father who took his son to Madison Square Garden and said, "One day, son, one day." Every Knicks fan who had been mocked, who had been clowned on by Lakers fans and Celtics fans and Bulls fans and everyone else who got to celebrate while New York suffered. Finish the job was 53 years compressed into 3 words. And they finished it. Now here's what makes this story truly remarkable, if you think about it. Think about everything that had to happen for this championship to be real. Leon Rose had to bet on his vision when nobody believed in it. He had to build a team that felt like a family at a time when the Knicks were one of the most dysfunctional franchises in professional sports. He had to find the right players. And he did, piece by piece, trade by trade, signing by signing. Jalen Brunson had to bet on himself. Had to come to New York, the most scrutinized, most criticized sports market in America, and decide that the pressure wouldn't break him. That the spotlight wouldn't shrink him. That he was big enough, in every way that mattered, to carry the weight of an entire city on his 6'2" frame. Karl-Anthony Towns had to carry grief and turn it into greatness. Had to take the loss of his mother and somehow transform it into fuel rather than letting it consume him. Had to prove that the doubts, that he couldn't win, that he crumbled under pressure, that he was a stats-first guy who didn't deliver when it counted, were wrong. Every single one of them. Josh Hart had to dive on floors, fight for every loose ball, accept a role that didn't always look glamorous but was absolutely essential to everything the Knicks did. OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges had to be the unsung warriors, the defensive pillars, the guys who didn't always get the headlines but got the stops that mattered. And the fans, the long-suffering, never-leaving, always coming-back fans of New York City, had to keep believing through 53 years of darkness. All of it had to happen. Every single piece. And it did. There's a line from the Bible, from Isaiah, that goes, "Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." Knicks fans didn't have a Bible. They had Cameron. And Cameron looked into that camera and gave them wings. Hip-hop and basketball have always been the twin languages of New York City. Born from the same concrete. Raised by the same streets. Fueled by the same hunger and the same pride and the same refusal to be ordinary. When Curtis Blow rapped about basketball in 1984, when Biggie shouted out the Knicks, when Jay-Z and Cameron recorded "Welcome to New York City," when every rapper from the 5 boroughs ever name-dropped Madison Square Garden or Walt Frazier or Patrick Ewing, they were doing something bigger than just making music. They were stitching a quilt. A cultural quilt that said, "This is who we are. This is what we love. This is what makes us New York." And Cameron, who once told stories in his lyrics about going from delivering drugs in Baltimore to being front and center at a Knicks game, had always represented both sides of that quilt. The streets and the arena. The hunger and the joy. The kid who came up hard and never forgot where he came from, even when fame and money tried to change the address. He sat on First Take, a Harlem kid made good, and he looked at the camera that connects him to the whole world, and he said the thing that every Knicks fan on earth was feeling but couldn't quite articulate. And then, in a moment that will be written into the history of New York sports forever, they did. What does it mean for a city to finally win? What does it mean for a fan base that has been patient and loyal through 53 years of waiting, 53 years of close calls and heartbreaks and blown leads and wrong turns, to finally see their team standing at the top? It means everything. It means the kids who grew up without ever knowing what a Knicks championship felt like now have something to hold on to. It means the old-timers who remembered 1973 can rest a little easier. It means that Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens and every corner of New York City can hold its head just a little higher. Sports matter because they give us something to share. A common language. A common heartbeat. You don't have to speak the same language to cry at the same moment. You don't have to come from the same neighborhood to feel the same joy. And on the night of June 13, 2026, New York City had one heartbeat, 1 pulse, 1 voice. And if you listen closely, Beneath the roar of the crowd and the noise of celebration and the tears and the laughter and the horns honking all the way up 7th Avenue, you could hear it point 3 words. Finish the job. Finish the job. And they did.